had that happened, would have been a disaster scenario for Europe because you would have utterly new rules of the game. We're not talking about the Georgia invasion of 2008, where Russia bit off two small pieces of Georgia, or a Russian military presence in Moldova. Those are important events, but they're not transformative. We're talking about the European map being completely redrawn through military force.
Hey, it's Marcel Dersis, and this is The Next Best. We're now multiple years into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and an end to the fighting isn't in sight. There are now negotiations, but where could these negotiations lead? What happens if Russia wins? And why did Putin decide to invade in the first place? To answer these questions, I speak to Michael Kimmage. Michael is the director of the Kennan Institute in Washington, D.C., and a professor of history at the Catholic University of America. His latest book is called Collisions: The War in Ukraine and the Origins of the New Global Instability. Let's go. Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you wrote a series of articles around Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And what you did was look at different types of scenarios. What would a Russian victory look like? What would a Ukrainian victory look like? And all kinds of things in the middle. And they really stuck with me. I think, firstly, that's because I don't think we think in scenarios enough. So it's useful just as an analytical tool. But then also because of the analysis itself, which was really insightful. So my first question is, what would Russian victory actually look like?
Well, first of all, thank you. And just a quick word about the scenario articles. I think the value of them obviously is not in their capacity to predict the future, which is limited in all of our cases, whether we're doing scenarios or not. Their value is in registering, especially back in 2022, how momentous of an event the war in Ukraine actually is. And of course, I think that's just everything. Everybody felt that back in 2022, but I think it was useful to try to spell that out, that this is a transformative event. I would go so far as to say that 1914 and 2022 are comparable in terms of how dramatic the changes are that are emanating from this particular conflict. So that's a general point in terms of scenarios. It's just to take the mind from where it is and its kind of status quo state, and to bring it forward a few years and to recognize that something extraordinary is happening around us and to us. Russian victory was, I think, easier to define back in 2022 when a colleague of mine and I, Liana Fix, wrote a piece, What If Russia Wins? It was actually published a few days before the February 24th, 2022 invasion, because I think then it was possible to envision the Ukrainian polity imploding, which was the Russian intent, and some form of colonization or even conquering of Ukraine that could have occurred. Shock and awe, I think, was the method that the Kremlin was pursuing. And we can say now that it was impossible, but that was the assessment of the U.S. intelligence services, that Ukraine would fall apart. And I think many observers, even in Ukraine, thought that that might happen. And that then in 2022, had that happened, would have been a disaster scenario for Europe because you would have utterly new rules of the game. We're not talking about the Georgia invasion of 2008, where Russia bit off two small pieces of Georgia, or a Russian military presence in Moldova. Those are important events, but they're not transformative. We're talking about the European map being completely redrawn through military force. And that would have, by definition, created a dramatically new Europe, both in what Russia was trying to create and the kind of response, counter-response that would have inspired. I find it more difficult now to speculate about Russian victory. It does, I guess, trace the same set of circumstances, that there would be civic collapse in Ukraine, political collapse of some kind, and Russia would be able to exert its will broadly across the country. But the fact of the matter is that we're very far from that scenario at the moment. And so I guess the question, I'll stop here, we could explore it further, of course. The question is more what partial Russian victory might look like, which I think at this stage is the only thing Russia is capable of.
Yeah. Obviously, the situation has changed now, but I still think there's value in exploring what things could have looked like. Because nowadays, a lot of people say, oh, well, the Russians just want a bit of land. They just want Ukraine to not be in NATO. What they were actually trying to do is, they did march on Kiev, They just failed. Zelenskyy would be dead, and more or less the entire country would be under the control of Moscow, right?
Well, correct. And, not only would that be enormous because we're speaking of a population in Ukraine of between 30 and 40 million people and territory, if you think about it historically, that is of incredible strategic significance, for the Black Sea region, the connecting links or disconnecting links between Russia and Europe for the status of Poland and Hungary and Slovakia, Romania, Moldova. So all of that in one moment would have been rendered just much more unstable. And of course, refugee flows and the economic repercussions of Russian victory would have been profound. I think that the Russian hope, and maybe this is a scenario worth considering, although I think it's more remote at the present day, but I think the Russian hope is that victory in Ukraine would have divided Europe. That you would have a Europe defined very much by fear. This is a Europe you can see in 2025. This is Scandinavia, Poland, the Baltics, the kind of immediate neighbors. And then you might have had a Europe, I'm thinking back in 2022 at the initial stage of the invasion, that might have been defined by a willingness to appease Russia. And so you would have a Europe militarizing against Russia on one hand. You would have a Europe exploring some kind of modus vivendi with Russia, maybe everybody motivated out of fear. And we're talking pre-Trump or pre-second Trump term. But that would have meant a fracturing of the NATO alliance and probably a fracturing of the transatlantic relationship because the U.S. would have to choose whether it sides with the more militarized or the more appeasing elements in Europe. And I think that that was in some respects the biggest dream that Russia had. It wasn't just to control Ukraine. It was to reorder European security. I think that that ambition is still there in Moscow, and to do so through a kind of internal fragmentation that the response to Russian victory would have generated. So not only would the war in some ways have shifted westward, the very substance and nature of Europe in security terms would have been revolutionized. And of course, you have lots of Europe, and this is still true at the present moment. The Portugals, the Greeces, the Italys, the Austrias, the countries that either by political logic or geographic logic feel less connected to the conflict, and that would have been a further fragmentation. And I think that was the Russian gamble, that they could win in Ukraine and they could fragment Europe.
Yeah. And I guess in addition to that fragmentation, you would also have paralysis, because realistically speaking, when you're under siege in that way, I guess neither the European Union nor NATO would have really had any capacity for anything else but dealing with this problem, right?
Precisely. That's where we need to recognize that we've actually traveled a significant distance, for all that there's tension between Washington and European capitals at the moment, and Europe could be doing more. And I think everybody is aware of the problems. I'm sure we'll discuss them in a moment. They're deep. But what Russia expended in not winning in 2022 was the element of surprise. And Europe and the United States were completely unprepared for the Russian invasion in February 2022. We can say that the U.S. was readying itself for the war and beginning to help Ukraine and doing some degree of public intelligence sharing. That's true back in 2022, but the U.S. has no idea why Russia is going to invade, and doesn't really, I think, understand the scale of the invasion. And if anything, European countries, Germany comes to mind, are less prepared for this invasion psychologically, practically, economically, militarily. So that paralysis would have been absolutely immediate. It would have been visceral had Russia achieved a sort of stunning, quick victory in Ukraine because of the lack of preparation. We're still struggling with the after effects of that lack of preparation. We're not where we need to be. But the last 3 years have manifested many changes, Zeitenwendes of many kinds across Europe and even within the U.S. But the element of surprise, and here we need to start thinking about February 24, 2022, the day of invasion. We need to start thinking about it historically. It's important historically to reconstruct how much of an advantage that was for Russia and how much of a disadvantage that was for Europe.
Yeah, and since you brought it up, why did Russia invade Ukraine?
I have written a book on the topic, and it's a very fair question, but for purposes of intellectual integrity, I will say that we have a lot still to learn on this account. We don't have a good document trail. We don't have people who have defected from the Russian system who have laid out in detail what the Kremlin was thinking. So a bit of humility is in order. I think for me, the best way of thinking about it is that there were several boxes that Putin was trying to check in 2021, 2022, and he felt that he could check all of them through invasion. So one box is just what to do about Ukraine. That you have Zelenskyy, who comes to power in 2019. He's not compliant. He's not pro-Russian in the way the Kremlin wanted him to be, what to do about that. Secondly, what to do about the kind of inadequate gains, looking at it from Putin's perspective, that Russia makes in 2014, 2015, that gets solidified in what's called Minsk diplomacy. And it's just not enough for Russia to control even the region, not to mention the country. So that's a second box. A third box is a Europe that Putin perceives to be inhospitable to Russia, unwilling to accommodate either Russia's real security demands or Putin's ego. Often those are the same thing in the Kremlin's outlook. But Europe is intransigent, and I think I would look at the U.S. in a somewhat different way. The fourth box that I can think of is a United States that Putin perceives to be in decline, struggling with the after effects of the Iraq and Afghanistan war, not domestically unified. And so, how do you take advantage of this moment of American weakness? So, Europe the irritant, America the weak, Ukraine the problematic, and the Russian presence in Ukraine. Crimea is all to the good, but the Donbass is an unresolved problem. So you check all four of those boxes by invading.
Yeah, I did always wonder because when you talk to people about this, they often bring up NATO and they often bring up Ukraine moving closer to the West in general. It doesn't seem to be the deciding factor, but I think it might have something to do with the timing. Because if you are intent on subjugating Ukraine, it is easier to do, when they're not as close to the West. So while it might not be the decisive factor in the decision to invade, it could influence the timing of the invasion. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that that's very true, that there's a trajectory. And, the NATO factor deserves attention. It deserves analysis. It's omnipresent in Putin's rhetoric, so it deserves analysis, at least on that level, why it's so often referred to. And I think Putin knew going back to 2008 when NATO summit in Bucharest, it was declared that Ukraine and Georgia would become NATO members. I think he knew it would never happen. I don't think that he was misguided or misled on that point, that there wasn't enough political will, and Ukraine was in some ways unwieldy for NATO. But yes, Putin resented and perhaps even feared the growing alignment with Ukraine and European militaries, the U.S. military. You have a visit from Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense. I think it's in October of 2021 to Kiev, where he makes some pretty forthright statements about the partnership between the U.S. And Ukraine. The very presence of an American Secretary of Defense in Ukraine is probably unacceptable for Putin. So yes, that I think contributes to a sense that this is all going in the wrong direction for Russia and something has to be done. And a bit like the U.S., I find that there are quite a few parallels between the mistakes Putin has made in Ukraine and the mistakes the U.S. has made going back to the Vietnam War. When you have the option of military force, you have to face the temptation of military force. And that's not the problem of Luxembourg and it's not the problem of Canada, but it is the problem of countries like the US and Russia. And so with the temptation of military force to be the answer, I think that's where Putin ended up very, very, very detrimentally for Russia, not to mention for the rest of us.
Yeah, you mentioned Ukraine being somewhat unwieldy for NATO. And of course, the same would also be true for Russia in a sense. And what you write in one of your articles is that all too often, countries defeat themselves over time by launching and then winning the wrong wars. So I guess my question would be, if Russia had succeeded, and they had succeeded all the way, and they would have marched to Kiev and they would have gotten Zelenskyy, what would that have actually meant for Russia?
Right. This, I think, is a very important point to remember in the present day, because we're thinking now about negotiated settlements to the war, what configuration is necessary, how much Ukraine is going to have to yield. It's clear that Ukraine is not going to win and that there's going to be some compromise in the future or just a very long conflict. But to understand the steep mountain that Russia built for itself strategically with this invasion, for me, is essential. So we're talking about a landmass. I'll do it in American terms because I'm not quite sure in European terms, but it's a landmass the size of Texas, and it's a population of tens of millions of people. And the very manner of Russia's invasion and then occupation, we're familiar, of course, with Bucha and Irpin, sites of war crimes and atrocities, but on balance, even the less hardcore occupations of Ukrainian territory have been brutal and have manifested efforts at sweeping Russification and such. Russia has waged a war almost calculated to push Ukrainians against Russians. In the name of bringing Russians and Ukrainians together. So it has the logic of a Kafka short story, all of this. But that means, in practical terms, that if Russia were to, quote unquote, successfully occupy Ukraine, let's say for the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years, it would have to be through military force, coercion, and colonial administration. Now, there are historical examples of this. It's not without precedent, and it's certainly not without precedent in Eastern and Central Europe, which has a long history of empire in which Russia is integrally involved. But empire is not a simple project. Empire is a demanding project. And what you need for empires to really flourish, this is a simple lesson of imperial history, is you need either an indifferent or a compliant population, and you need to be able to co-opt local elites. Now, all of that might have been possible 20 years ago if Russia had approached Ukraine in economic terms and thought of different kinds of partnership. And that's kind of what happens between 2010 and 2013 when you do have a pro-Russian leader in Ukraine. But none of that is possible in an easy way after 2022. And so the more territory that Russia takes in Ukraine, in some ways, the more its problems grow, which is not an unfamiliar problem in the story of empires.
So obviously we can't look inside Putin's head, but what do you think he thought at that moment of this invasion? How do you think he thought this would play out? Was he just overly optimistic? Is he delusional? You know, what is going on in Moscow?
I don't think delusional in the clinical sense. And I don't have that impression listening to Putin now, despite his reference to Europeans as pigs in a speech and strange things that he does. I wouldn't say that Donald Trump is fundamentally delusional, although that's not your that's not your question, I know. But you have hot-headed leaders, emotional leaders who can seem that way, but who I think aren't in a kind of practical sense. You know, I think it's a convergence of a few factors, some of which approach delusion. What's very significant, what's very important is Putin's status as a dictator. That's not what Putin is in 2014 when he annexes Crimea. Then he's still an authoritarian leader of Russia, but not quite a dictator. By 2022, Putin is in complete charge of Russia, meaning that he's surrounded by these kind of often from his young adulthood, Putin's young adulthood in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and they're all completely dependent on him for their fortunes and their power. And of course, they tell him what he wants to hear. And the whole system, Putin has been Russia's president since 2000, so it's 22 years that he's Russia's president. At the time of the invasion, you have a whole system created to flatter, to appeal to the vanity, and to tell Putin that what he wants to do is going to succeed brilliantly. I think that creates a delusional atmosphere, but sort of like the delusional atmosphere in Washington before the invasion of Iraq. It's not that George W. Bush was clinically insane. It's just that he had a lot of sycophants and yes men and bad information around him. That's one part of it. I think the other part is that, people make these calculations on paper, and on paper, Russia had dozens of advantages that Ukraine didn't have in 2022. It's a much bigger military. It's a bigger economy. Russia's a nuclear power. Ukraine is not. There is a long history, which we should be well aware of in the present, of the West betraying Ukraine, going all the way back to the Treaty of Versailles, where Ukraine has been conquered, taken over, made a part of different empires, Soviet Union, and that's not been contested. And so I think Putin could sketch out on paper a reality where it's very easy for him to take Ukraine, and where basically the world bows down to that circumstance after the fact. And of course, this dictatorial system where everybody is telling him he's a genius only contributes to that. So a kind of war optimism of an extraordinary magnitude.
Yeah, so that would be an outright Russian victory. Let's go to the other end of that spectrum and look at what a Ukrainian victory might look like. You wrote that the most plausible Ukrainian victory would be winning small. Can you explain what winning small could have looked like for Ukraine?
Right. Winning small is, establishing, control over a very sizable amount of Ukrainian territory in a way that's happened. We've seen that come to pass, especially in September of 2022, a few months into the war. Ukraine was able to take back, northern territory, the territory north of Kiev. It was able to take back, areas around Kharkiv, and Kherson was retaken by Ukraine. At the time, these felt like big victories. In the scheme of things, they're still small victories. So as many of those as possible, and a network of small localized victories that just make the war look impossible to win to Russia. And that, of course, is the hardest part about winning small, because winning small probably also means winning slow. You have years and years of conflict when Ukraine is not able to win big. But I think it's easy and it's necessary to take winning big off the table. Right? For winning big, you kind of have to go to Moscow. You have to have the conventional military victory that ends a war on your terms, and that's utterly impossible for Ukraine, and it's not something that Zelenskyy has entertained for obvious reasons. And so you have to build up small victories, and that can also mean diplomatic victories. And I think some of those have also been achieved since 2022 for Ukraine. Ukraine is much closer to Europe. You have a German chancellor who regularly and forthrightly and robustly speaks in praise of the military partnership between Germany and Ukraine. That's not where Ukraine was 5 years ago, but that's where Ukraine is now. And then, of course, staying afloat, the economic victories are also important. We're at a sort of transitional moment there with Ukraine's economy, whether it can get the funds it needs to keep on going for the next couple of years. But that, too, is winning small. Defense industrial production here, Ukraine has been often quite brilliant. Drone warfare innovations and giving it the capacity to strike within Russia, Russian airplanes, recently a Russian submarine. Those are also small victories. And so small victories are going to add up at some point. This is the assumption to the perception of futility in Moscow. We're just not going to swallow this country. We can't do it. It's too difficult. And so either we'll just turn around and retreat, which I think is unlikely, or we'll, in a general way, sue for peace and try to achieve some kind of compromise where Russia holds on to a degree of Ukrainian territory, but then Ukraine goes its way. I still believe that this is possible. I don't know if it's likely at this point, but I believe it's possible. And I also believe it's of strategic significance for the countries that are supporting Ukraine, that you don't measure everything in terms of the big victory. You need that other unit of measurement for the small victory.
Yeah. So one option would be to march on Moscow, which was always highly unlikely. The other option, I guess, would be a collapse of the regime in Russia. What do you make of that possibility? Do you think that was ever realistic?
Well, we did have the mutiny in the summer of 2023, the Prigozhin mutiny, where a kind of strange figure in the Russian system, a crony of Putin's and a kind of mercenary figure, emerged as a local leader and then took troops on a mad mission to Moscow to do something. I'm not sure, to have a meeting with the boss or to topple the system. It's still kind of unclear. But what was striking at that moment was how thin the support for Putin was. That a lot of elites were on the verge of leaving the country or perhaps collaborating with the mutiny. So that's a window into the weaknesses of that system. But, I think we have to accept the evidence that's in front of our eyes. Putin is a dictator. He commands incredible mechanisms of repression in Russia, from the army to the secret police to the educational system and to the media system. And I'm not sure he has to always use repression and manipulation to get support for the war. I think Russians, and here too I draw my insight from the American political experience, Russians don't want to lose the war. Most Russians are probably not pro-war, but I think that they are anti-war. That was true for America in Vietnam. We're focused historically in this country a lot on the anti-war movement, but it never succeeded really at the ballot box. You have a lot of anti-war sentiment in the U.S., and that's what keeps the U.S. and Vietnam for so long. So Putin has that to work with. And it's anybody's guess what the relation of normal Russians is to this war at this point. I don't even know how we can answer the question. All we can do is pose it, but there's no visible evidence of a major anti-war movement or a break from Putin. And of course, most Russians, more than half, get their livelihood in some way from the state. So even if you were anti-war, your incentives to topple the government or shred Putin's power are small. So it seems to me like he sits atop a mechanism that can be used to wage war for a long time to come.
I wanted to ask you about the Western strategy in dealing with Ukraine and dealing with this war. I get the sense that there was a lot of concern in Western capitals among policymakers as to what may happen if the Ukrainians actually look to be close to winning. Because there was this idea that if the Ukrainians are actually pushing, and it looks as if the Russians could actually lose and could actually be driven back towards Russia, what is Putin going to do? Is he going to take the risk of escalation? Might we see even the use of tactical nuclear weapons? And because Western capitals desperately wanted to avoid that, they calibrated their support for Ukraine in a way that didn't quite let the Ukrainians lose, but also made it essentially impossible for them to win, if there was ever such a possibility. What do you make of that?
I'm not sure. Here I would want to know. I would want to know more. I think when it comes to the constraints on Western support for Ukraine, we fear of escalation is there. And I think Russia, especially in sort of September, October of 2022, exploited or manipulated that fear. I think that that's a fair generalization. But the constraints come from so many different sources. There are financial constraints on how much support can be given to Ukraine. In the case of the U.S. and many European countries, the kind of assistance that was given to Ukraine, artillery shells, other forms of weaponry, were taken out of stockpiles that were considered to be important for internal defense, so for conflicts other than in the war in Ukraine. And so that was a constraint. I think that there have been, this is the less told story of the West in Ukraine, certain reservations about Zelenskyy's leadership. We've seen a massive corruption scandal in Ukraine in the last couple of weeks, and the issue of corruption has always been on the mind of Western policymakers when it comes to Ukraine. And I think that's a bit of a constraint. I think there was also another constraint that there was a perception that Ukraine wanted to pull the West into the war. And so using Western weaponry to make strikes inside of Russia might be one way of doing that. And so there was concern about that going beyond certain thresholds. So I think you put all of those constraints together, it's quite a lot, and it tells a story all its own. And I don't think, here is where I would need to defer to people who have sharper and better expertise than my own, but I don't think that Ukraine was on the verge of objective victory in the fall of 2022 and could have achieved it if only it had received Taurus missiles or Tomahawk missiles or, this or that weapon system. The problem that Ukraine faces, even at its glorious moment of taking territory back, the problem that Ukraine faces in the fall of 2022 is still enormous because it's the problem of the Russian economy and the Russian defense industrial system and of the Russian military, which is present in Crimea and throughout many parts of Ukraine, that I think Ukraine was not on the edge of retaking. So I guess in the end, to go back to the essence of your question, I'm skeptical that this is the correct reading. I don't think that there was a magic weapon that would have led to much different outcomes, and I don't think that there was a magic moment. But looking back at 2022, we could maybe take the nuclear part of it out of the equation. I'm sure that there were a lot of missed opportunities in 2022, and those are opportunities that concern where Ukraine made its strikes, how it made its strikes, how it assessed its resources. Because we get to the summer of 2023, and then we have the failed counteroffensive, and something is really starting to go wrong, both with the Ukrainian and the Western approach to the war. So I would focus attention more on those issues maybe than on fears of nuclear escalation.
Hey, it's me. Apologies for the interruption. If you've made it this far, do me a favor and subscribe to the podcast. I've been told that it really helps, so that'd be great. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to imply that the Ukrainians were close to victory and then Western capitals deliberately pulled the plug. But what I am saying is that I get the impression that Ukrainian victory never really was the objective for a lot of these countries because they were worried as to what catastrophic success could look like in that sense.
That's part of it, but there's also the strategic conundrum of Ukrainian victory when you're not able to defeat Russia in and of itself. So, let's imagine a scenario where Ukraine would have retaken all of its territory by the end of the calendar year 2022. I don't think that would have ended the war. Russia would have regrouped and then reinvaded. You think of the length of that border, then you factor in Belarus, which is where, Russia invaded from in 2022. And it would have just been the end of chapter 1 of the war. And then chapter 2, I think, would have been a series of reinvasions, maybe in 2023 or maybe afterwards. But the war wouldn't really have come to an end. And I can't blame Western policymakers for being unable to solve that dilemma because it's an insoluble dilemma of how you deal with security and create conditions of peace when you have a hostile neighbor that can't be defeated.
I'm not blaming them. I think it's an incredibly difficult trade-off, and intelligent, well-meaning people can come down on either side of it. I mean, I wouldn't want to make these decisions. But, having studied dictators for a long time, I think this was one of the cases in which we actually had a lot of leverage because we had an influence on how the war goes, but we were perhaps less willing to use that leverage than we would have been if they didn't have nuclear weapons and if there hadn't been this justified fear of escalation in that sense.
No, I agree. The lack of urgency is going to be very hard to explain in the future, and I'm afraid that lack of urgency extends all the way up to the present moment. Whether that's dictated by fears of nuclear escalation, by our own preoccupations with ourselves and inability to see how important Ukraine is for Europe and for the region, I'm not sure what the perfect explanation is, but the lack of urgency is baffling.
Talking about the present moment, you're American. You used to work on Ukraine and Russia at the State Department, and trying to be diplomatic, but what the hell is going on in Washington?
Well, that's a difficult question. Let me try to break it down as best I can. In 2024, President Trump made a series of promises about the war in Ukraine that were campaign promises. And we can remember that in 2016, there were certain promises that were also made, such as the recognition of Crimea for the sake of a better working relationship with Russia. That was promised on the campaign trail. In 2024, you have the promise that the war is going to end in a day, that it's Biden's war, that there are these sort of very clear obstacles to creating peace, and that the personality of Trump and the election of Trump is going to bring peace to the region. That was a campaign promise, completely unrealistic at the time, and demonstrably unrealistic when Trump came to power for the second time in January 2024. I think what you see after that, and of course, life is always much more complicated when you govern. And this does remind me to a degree of the first term when there was not a major war in the region, is that Trump has no real agenda for Ukraine or for Russia. He does not know the incremental steps he wants to follow, and he doesn't know the destination he wants to achieve other than phrases like peace in the region or a working relationship. Those are not strategic objectives. Those are, again, kind of campaign phrases or phrases for domestic political consumption. And so, in the absence of an agenda, what you get is a very instinct driven policy toward Ukraine. And all I can say as a matter of generalization, and I think we've all witnessed this over the last 11, 12 months, is that the instincts go through different cycles. And so, first it was an optimism that Trump's charisma could bring big results. And then it was frustration with Zelenskyy. I think we can all remember the Oval Office meeting in February where, the two of them are shouting at each other. And then there's the withdrawal of U.S. assistance to Ukraine for a couple of days, and then that assistance comes back online. Then you have the U.S. pushing for a ceasefire, seeming to put pressure on Russia, sort of an escalation of words between Dmitry Medvedev in Russia and Putin on social media, where it almost felt like there was going to be a clash between Russia and the U.S., and that's followed by the Anchorage summit in Alaska, which is supposed to bring an end to the war, but does nothing. And then we've seen that cycle kind of speed up in the last couple of weeks and months, where there's this promise that the war is coming to an end. You get Secretary Rubio saying we're making breakthroughs and making great headway, but you're still back to square one because the U.S., first of all, it's very difficult to do diplomacy when you don't have a real agenda, but the U.S. leverage in Ukraine is limited. And it's limited by choice with the Trump administration because they won't put pressure on Russia and they've diminished their support to Ukraine. So the U.S. is decreasing as a factor. It still matters on the world stage and can still do this kind of theatrical diplomacy. But Europe is the more important place now for the prosecution of the war. And Ukraine is a very important place. And so the end phase of the war will be decided more in Ukraine and more in Europe than it will in Washington. And yet Trump approaches all of this as if he can kind of single-handedly come up with a solution. And so he fails and he fails and he fails. And I don't really see how the cycle is going to change unless there's a real change of attitude in the White House. But that's hard to imagine. So it's a cycle of failure. It is over the last year.
And the other thing is, I guess, oftentimes when people talk about this, they talk about Zelenskyy and him not wanting to make a deal. They kind of ignore domestic constraints in Ukrainian politics, right? Because Zelenskyy is not a dictator. He can't just do whatever he wants. He has to look out for public opinion. And that's clearly a constraint in these negotiations. I mean, there are some things that he can't agree to, even if he wants to.
Absolutely. And I'm not sure how much he really wants to. I mean, I think it's captured perfectly in some ways in the exchange between President Trump and Zelenskyy back in February in the Oval Office, when President Trump said, you don't have the cards, and President Zelensky's response is, I'm not playing cards. Now, these are simple words in a way, but actually they're a window into the reality of this war. The United States can easily afford an inadequate peace in Ukraine. Trump will call it a victory. It will be the 11th of his wars and conflicts that he's resolved, and he'll move on to something else. And if there are problems in the future, he'll pretend they don't exist. And the U.S. can afford that because Ukraine is thousands of miles from the U.S., and a lot of Americans don't see much of a connection between U.S. security and Ukrainian security. Zelenskyy can't afford that at all. What Ukraine cannot afford is a repetition of 2014, 2015. In 2014, 2015, one can go into the details of that diplomacy, but to generalize, Ukraine kind of accepted a Russian presence in Crimea, Russian occupation of Crimea, and accepted a Russian presence and occupation of eastern Ukraine or the Donbass. It didn't like it, but it didn't contest. And then where does Ukraine get invaded from in 2022? It gets invaded from those very territories. It's the most successful part of the Russian invasion in 2022 is from the south. It's from Crimea, a heavily militarized region. So Zelenskyy, yes, for domestic political reasons, but I think also for very urgent strategic reasons, cannot concede territory to Russia that Russia will use in the future for the next round of this war. He has to come up with some other solution. And I think he will with his partnership with the Europeans, who I think for the most part recognize that Zelenskyy is right in this respect. Okay, Hungary and a few countries may differ, but the consensus in Europe on this point remains. And I think President Trump runs the risk of becoming irrelevant to the conflict. He's unable to see the world in those terms because he's relevant at all times, in all places, in his own eyes. But unless the US can come up with a real approach that deals with the very, very real and sort of life and death questions that Zelenskyy and Ukrainian polity face, the US is going to be on the sidelines. And that feels to me like where we are at the moment. And I wonder if that will sink in Washington and there'll be a kind of loss of interest in Ukraine, or less probably whether Washington will reconsider its approach.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I don't think it helps that Washington itself doesn't seem to know what it really wants. You've got all these different people in Trump's orbit basically arguing amongst each other. Many of them have no idea what's going on in general because they don't know anything about any of this. But what are your thoughts about Europe's approach? Like, how well are they doing? How badly are they doing? Obviously, they're trying to pull Trump back in whenever they have an opportunity to do so. And it's incredibly humiliating for everybody involved. But, is there really an alternative to what they're doing? Could they be doing better? And if so, what could they do?
Yeah, I think the hedging in Europe makes fundamental sense, and I agree that it's painful and humiliating. One could add that it's at times humiliating for American citizens to observe the kinds of diplomatic rituals that the Trump administration has created over the last year. But that's just a footnote. But I think to hedge makes a lot of sense. There's no great value for Europe from a visible divorce and break, although it might be emotionally satisfying, because the American system is complicated. There's a lot of inertia in it. There's a lot of incompetence, and it's better to have Trump even vaguely on board than to have Trump not on board. The optics of that are better. There are a lot of practical logistical things that work better if the U.S. is providing intelligence and targeting to Ukraine. And if the price of that is sort of flattering Trump, it's a high price, I think. It's not a low price, it's a high price. But in the spirit of hedging, it makes sense. Trump is weakening domestically. He doesn't have the support of the Republican Party on Russia and Ukraine. That is, to me, a very important data point. And Trump is likely, or the Republicans are likely, to lose the midterm elections if you can project from this moment outward. After that point, Trump will be a lame duck president, and there'll be a competition for the successor to Trump in the Republican Party. And the Democrats remain strongly in favor of Europe and strongly in favor of supporting Ukraine. So when you factor in that whole landscape, I think to hedge makes a lot of sense in Europe. But one point about what Europe is achieving and one point about worries and questions one could have, I think that Europe has traveled an extraordinary distance, Germany in particular. And when you look at the ability of Chancellor Merz to bring different European leaders together, from Poland to the UK, you see something that's working in European foreign policy. And also, I think, because words do matter in all of this, the clarity of expression that Chancellor Merz has about Ukraine and at times about the US and also about European imperatives and about Russia is valuable. And I think it makes a difference. So there's a new financial commitment to security, a wavering financial commitment to Ukraine, and a kind of intellectual clarity that's going to be very helpful in the future. And it's nice to see that Germany is providing leadership in this regard. Germany is certainly not the problem. It feels often like the solution to the problem. But one has to acknowledge, I suppose, just the historically unusual nature of the European Union and of Europe as a foreign policy actor. It's not an empire. I'm not sure if it's a confederation. It kind of is a confederation in some ways. Confederations usually work best when they're defending against an adversary. And it's certainly not, a single nation state, Europe. It's anything but that. And so, the lack of coordination, this is a point many people have made. It's kind of an obvious point, but it is the answer to your question in terms of what to worry about. The lack of coordination, the capacity Russia has to play the divide and conquer game in Europe, how things get tangled up in procedure. We kind of see this with the Russian sovereign assets that may or may not be seized. It's just procedurally very difficult. It means that Europe moves slowly and that there isn't one single executive intelligence making decisions. And that, in military terms, I think is just by definition difficult. And you kind of see that difficulty on a daily basis. And it makes it even harder to kind of distance Europe from the US at a time when that might be desirable for Europe.
I wanted to ask two more questions. And one of them is the question of European security guarantees, or also American security guarantees. So let's say a deal is made more or less along current lines, although, whether that actually happens remains to be seen. But let's say there is some sort of deal. How credible can European or American security guarantees realistically be? Because if I look around, I do not see a willingness, either in the population or in capital cities, to really fight and potentially die for Ukraine. But if that's the case, how good are these security guarantees really?
Yeah, no, I agree. And this problem goes back to the 90s when there's something called the Budapest Memorandum, which is a guarantee of Ukraine's sovereignty, ironically from Russia as well. And there was nothing behind it. You know, in 2014, I remember this well because I was working in government at the time, 2015, when Minsk diplomacy was being worked out. You have the phrase from Chancellor Merkel, Angela Merkel, that there's no military solution to the conflict, which is astonishing in retrospect. I thought it was persuasive at the time. I think what she meant is that you don't want to get tangled up in a war over Ukraine, and nobody did back then. But still, if it's a war, either there's a military solution or there's no solution, and it was a mischaracterization of the war. And you know, if 4 years into the war, no outside power has been willing to send its soldiers in directly, it's hard to imagine that they're going to do so in the future, or would. If there would be a kind of peace based on security guarantees and Russia were to reinvade, we might be back where we are. We would likely be back where we are at the present moment. I'm not sure that this is sort of practical. It's hard to control these conversations, but if I could control the conversation, if I had that ability, I would shift it away from the abstract conversation about security guarantees, where there's a lot of insincerity, as there was about the promise to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO back in 2008. It's not sincere. It's not seriously intended. And we spend hours and hours talking about these things when you look back over the course of 2025, at the beginning of 2025, Ukraine had a marginal advantage in drone warfare, the number of drones and the technical nature of them. Over the last 4 or 5 months now, Russia has a marginal advantage in drone warfare. I think that we would be better served talking intensely about those questions. How can we just do better in supporting Ukraine and the practical needs, air defense, drone warfare, other things? Perhaps we could do more with training of Ukrainian troops and then bringing them back into the conflict. It's what in Germany, Wolfgang Ischinger speaks about the porcupine strategy as opposed to security guarantees, and I think he's entirely correct. But let's talk about the details, the kind of practical responsibilities that come with the porcupine strategy. There we can contribute a lot. The security guarantees conversation feels often like a kind of academic balloon floating free from the actual conflict.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's really unfortunate about it is that it also consumes a lot of political capital. If you tell your population, hey, look, we're going to help the Ukrainians make drones, or we will make drones and we will send them to the Ukrainians, a lot of people will be like, yeah, sure, let's do it. Sounds good. But the moment that you tell them that you're going to send soldiers to Ukraine and that their husbands or sons might die in a potential war with Russia, yeah, I mean, public support for that is going to drop.
Yeah, it's basically zero in the U.S. for that line of effort.
Yeah, and I mean, who can realistically see Donald Trump go to war against Russia and Vladimir Putin to defend Odessa or Kiev?
Yeah, I mean, President Trump he's not doing a great job with Article 5 at the moment, which is a similar commitment to time-honored, established treaty allies of the United States. If he's having trouble with that, I would worry a lot about security guarantees for Ukraine.
Yeah, it's just not going to happen. I mean, I get why from a Ukrainian perspective you would want this, but realistically, I just don't think it's going to come to pass. So there's going to be plenty of time in the future to discuss all of the things that have gone wrong and that they could have gone differently. But from here on out, what will be the best case scenario for Ukraine, and how do Ukraine's partners make that more likely?
Yeah. No, I very much appreciate this as a final question. One point to make, just as a summing up point about the war itself, is that Ukraine and its partners have achieved a lot of success. Russia begins the war occupying about 11% of Ukraine's territory. Now it occupies about 19-20% of Ukraine's territory. Russia has expended enormous personnel, manpower, resources on the taking of medium-sized cities over the last couple of years. And it is moving forward, but it's really inching forward. And that is a Ukrainian success, and it's also a success for the countries that have been supporting Ukraine. Ukraine's not a brilliant democracy. It's under martial law, but it remains a pluralistic, fundamentally free society. That, too, is an achievement, and Ukraine is still functioning economically, not well, but still functioning in wartime, and that's another achievement. I think if we can have very sober strategic objectives, that our goal is to keep Ukraine in control of as much territory as possible. Our goal is a Ukraine that's not under Russian occupation, that is integrating in new ways, gradually, incrementally perhaps, into European structures, legal structures, commercial structures, and security structures. The war is a very unpredictable thing. And so this idea that Russia's only going to move ahead and have successes in the future, I don't know how that's gotten baked in at the moment, but it is kind of baked in at the moment. But there we have to have the vision to see beyond the present moment and to realize that with this war, Russia has created a challenge for itself that it can't meet. That's something that's very important to remember and to recognize on our side, that Russia's project of controlling Ukraine seems at this point destined to fail. And so our strategy, I suppose, is to contribute to that failure, to have patience to maintain and support the Ukraine that is under Ukrainian control, and to bring it with as much imagination and sort of ability as we can muster to bring it into Europe. I don't think that any of these aims are unachievable. They do require a Ukraine that's sort of on its feet. And we don't know in wartime what the breaking point for a society is, whether Zelenskyy might splinter as a ruler and whether the electrical grid in Ukraine might just be completely knocked out, and then you face a kind of sort of basic societal or economic collapse. All of those scenarios are quite real. I don't think we can forget them, but sort of a gradual, sober, modest strategy of defense and integration pursued over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years seems to me the right way to go. The challenge of our political leaders to articulate how slow and incomplete that's going to be, but also how necessary that's going to be. And, obviously Trump is not invested in that in the least. Keir Starmer and Macron have their domestic political difficulties. I suppose Chancellor Merz does as well. But to end on a positive note for a German audience, I think Chancellor Merz has articulated the stakes of this conflict and shown himself to be realistic about what may be possible in the future. So that leadership is not just conceivable, it's out there. It's just that we need more of it.
Well, that was super interesting. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Marcel.
That's it for this episode. If you want to stay in touch, like the podcast and subscribe. And if you have feedback or suggestions, leave a comment. I'll see you soon.